wanted to do this video, and really at the moment what I have is a title, and that title is Nature is My Culture, or I would like nature to be my culture. What does that mean? What that means is I have a cultural program I was born into, I was brought up in, and I would like to examine myself deeply enough through meditation to understand the raw elements of my human nature. And I would like to take those elements and make them into my cultural program, or rather my program. Those are the elements which should be my program. Now you could say, well, you don't need them to be in your program because they're already naturally part of you. You don't need to do anything to do that. Well, that's true, but what we do need to do is displace some of the things that I do because I've been told to do, or because I've been brought up in a certain way. We need to displace those things and replace them with other programs. So really this is me just making a blocker program that is congruent with my own nature. Furthermore, from a wider perspective, I think that nature should inform culture, in the sense that what actually is culture? What is it? Why do we do it? Well, I think that the reason we do culture, and the reason we have culture, is a survival mechanism. Now, it might be that this survival mechanism has evolved over time and has turned into something a lot more complicated perhaps than it needs to be. But ultimately, culture is a survival mechanism. And because it's a survival mechanism, it needs what does survival mean? Survival means adapting to your environment. Survival means sensitivity to your environment. Survival means the ability to adapt to that environment. But because culture is a survival mechanism, then any instinctive mechanism that I have to survive, which perhaps I'm being distracted from by culture, or instinctive mechanisms that we have as a species to survive, that perhaps we are as a species being distracted from because of culture, need to be brought back into a cultural mainstream. So this program needs to be sensitive to the environment in which it exists. And when you think about it, culture's environment is in fact our minds. It doesn't live in a physical world, it lives in our minds, in a mental world, and it adapts to that mental world. Now obviously that mental world is influenced by the physical world, but that's only an is influenced by statement. In fact, because of culture, we have to a certain degree isolated ourselves from the physical world. And what that means is that we are no longer ourselves individually as sensitive as we should be to what's happening in the physical world. Therefore, our minds, our collective minds, are not as sensitive as they should be to what's happening in the physical world. And therefore, our minds are not shaped to the physical world as much as they should be. And because our minds are not shaped to the physical world, that means that culture is not shaped to the physical world. So it's as if culture has somehow over the years, from starting out as a survival mechanism, started to cause its hosts, i.e. us, to perhaps it's a victim of its own success. So we've become so successful at surviving that we don't need to worry about what's going on in the physical environment around us as much. Of course, it's a problem. It's a bubble waiting to burst, of course. But in short-termism, we don't need to worry about what's happening in the environment around us as much anymore because we have cultural protection and the methods and ways of surviving, of feeding ourselves, clothing ourselves, giving ourselves warmth and heat and protection that have been built up by culture over the years have been so successful that we don't need to be sensitive to the physical environment as much anymore. And as such, perhaps culture is in fact a victim of its own success. And because it's been so successful at this, it no longer encourages its members to be sensitive to the physical environment. And therefore, it no longer is as sensitive as perhaps once it was to the physical environment. And so you could say that it's starting to, well, it has already started to look inward to itself and be distracted by its own creations. And we know that any organism that is not sensitive to its environment can adapt to its environment. Any organism that can't adapt to its environment isn't going to survive. So there's a problem, and people have been talking about this for as long as I've been alive, for as long as I can remember. No solution, of course, has been thus far delivered. Culture is obviously aware of this issue, but somehow still too many things to distract itself from the matter at hand. So by tuning into our own nature, our own physical animal nature, we can create a set of programming that stands a chance of possibly becoming or influencing the cultural program. In which case, then the cultural program takes this on board and is able to propagate this, and the species, therefore, this increases the probability of the survival of the species. So when I was investigating my meditation system and building it up, I made a mistake. The mistake I made, I knew that art had to be part of my meditation system. I knew that creativity had to be part of my meditation system. My mistake that I made was that I thought that this creativity, this art, needed to be physically manifested. That was a mistake. It doesn't need to be physically manifested. In fact, it needs to be culturally manifested. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has a physical presence, although it might do. If I draw a picture, it's definitely got a physical presence. But when it comes to digital information, arguably its presence is pretty much as good as the presence of nothing at all. That was the mistake I made. The mistake I made was that I knew that the environment had to be part of the meditation. So in an interaction with one's environment. The problem was that the mistake that I made was I assumed that the environment was always a physical thing, but that's not true. We live in a cultural environment and a physical environment. The two are very important. We know the impact that the physical environment can have on us, but let's realise the impact that the cultural environment can have on us. It can make us unhappy. It can make us do things that harm the physical environment and therefore harm us. Let's realise that. Furthermore, I think another mistake that I made was that with the other parts of my meditation system, we're dealing with a living being. in one part of my meditation system, I'm dealing with myself, and I'm a living being. And in another part of my meditation system, I'm dealing with other people, and they're living beings. But let's realise, perhaps, as well, that the environment is also a living being. And that in the bringing together of all these parts, self, environment, and other, there is a unity. I'm not saying that I am the universe, or I am you, or we are one, yeah? What I'm saying is that from my perspective, which is limited obviously, our actions organise to manifest something greater than me, and that this thing can be considered to be living. Now, in my last video, one of my last videos, I talked about consciousness and what would actually be required for consciousness to happen. In order for consciousness to happen, I said, what we need is a life form that is survival technique is to simulate its environment. Simulate its environment. And the way it simulates the environment is it gets data and consumes it, information, it consumes information, puts it together into a model of the environment, and it uses that environment model to make simple or complex decisions about what to do. And I think a lot of life forms, the higher life forms, mammals perhaps, have this ability. I don't know how far it goes, but the point is, anything that simulates its environment, i.e. imagines, is also capable of consciousness, because in that simulation, for it to be a decent simulation, you have to include yourself within that simulation. And the moment you start simulating yourself, then you have consciousness. So therefore, if these living beings that I talk about with culture is a living being, nature is a living being, perhaps even the two combined together as the environment, the environment, both the cultural and the natural environment, and the physical environment, cultural and physical environment, are possibly also a living being as well. And perhaps myself, the people I interact with, and our environment all add up to another living being. Now, I don't know whether this living being is conscious or not, but of course we know, or I believe, that consciousness will happen if this whatever living being we're discussing has the ability to imagine. Does culture have the ability to imagine? Well, I think it does. And that ability obviously comes through us. So yes, I think it does have the ability to imagine. So where am I going with this? Let's bring this home, because my car journey's come to an end. Let's end where I started. I would like culture, I would like nature to inform my programming, and my programming to inform the wider cultural programming. And therefore this requires two things. One, I get in touch with my instinctive nature, which I'm already doing through meditation. And two, that I express this in a cultural format, such as this video on the internet, using words. So that's all I want to say.